So I think that discussion that you just did around letter from Birmingham Jail is so powerful. And having seen it now a few times, I just think it's such a useful illustration of what implementing the Common Core could look like. And I also think, it's just such a powerful piece, right? And so hearing you talk about it and sort of like rereading it, and there's just tremendous power in that, rereading a text that is engaging and complex, and where you discover new things each time you think about it. I always think about around the letter, I always think about my favorite line. I know you mentioned Kate's favorite line, but my favorite line, where it's in a paragraph where King it plays with this notion of time, right? And the idea that time, I think time is neutral, right? He says, and then he has this line which I find very inspiring, because it captures so perfectly the urgency of his moment, and for me there are parallels to the urgency of this moment. But he says, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. Wow. And I like this notion that, people say, well, things will get better. No, things won't get better unless somebody does something to make things better. Yeah. And I think the Common Core, which is not nearly as powerful as social change, but is a complex thing that we're undertaking. The Common Core isn't just going to happen. It's not just going to roll in on the wheels of inevitability. People are going to have to dive in and start doing the work and start creating units that reflect the Common Core, and struggling themselves with the text and trying to figure out how to capture it right with students. And so I think there's a lot of lessons in that sense of urgency, and that notion that if we want to make something different, we've got to live that, and we've got to be that. Kate, I know you have some thoughts about how we should think about the work that needs to happen as you prepare to teach a text like this.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if we should maybe take some time, the three of us, to play with that idea, to play with that process a little bit, and kind of go with David into the text for a bit, and spend some time talking about maybe the first 20 paragraphs, and really try to see where we are in terms of our meaning making of the text itself, and talk a little bit about why teach it, how teach it, and kind of see where we get for a little bit.
And it's I think part of what you're saying is that in preparing to teach such a text, it's really important to talk about it, and talk about it with your colleagues. To not only we spent a lot of time working on these questions. Some fail, some work. They'll be tried out with kids. Some will work and some will fail. And also, just to note, one thing that's really fun about doing this kind of work is the extent to which the commissioner was moved by that phrase. I hadn't been moved the same way. And sharing a text in common allows you to see how the deep impacts it can have among different people, and learn from each other in that way. So that's fun too.
Great. So here's a question. So John was talking about a sentence later in the text. David, you mentioned a portion of paragraph 6 that kind of moved me. One of the things that I think about when I just kind of look at the text overall, that when I look at these first 20 paragraphs in particular, what is the point? And there's probably at least 6 or 7 answers. What is the point of teaching this? Why are we teaching this letter? What is the kind of learning outcome that we're hoping to get by pulling kids in to this letter?
And as I started describing it, Kate, I know that we're very comfortable setting very clear objectives when we begin teaching any specific thing.
Right.
But I think we have to have a caution that the specific objectives emerge in part from King himself. That is, as we get into the letter, only by getting into the letter can we really see what it has to offer us. We can't give it to you up front. So as we examine the letters, I think a few objectives emerged. We began to learn about different types of arguments and different kinds of evidence. Why I describe that. And so we said, what are the 3 reasons he gives in Birmingham, and why is he there, and the different reasons, and we began to see how it fit together. In paragraph, just moving past where I was, in paragraph, 11 and 12, he begins to address why at this time. And once again, he gives 3 different arguments. He follows a similar structure. What are they? How do they use evidence? So you might say one reason is it's a masterclass in the use of evidence and argument. That's one reason one might read the letter. But one might read the letter also because of the specific power of phrases like the ones we found, to encounter them, to explore them, that it's worth reading in that way because it survives under repeated reading. You might give historical reasons. This was a letter that has a huge effect on our society and on the way we think about things. But I think our objective in teaching it remains constant, which is the repeated encounter with something at this level of difficulty trains kids in things that are fundamental to their later success in college and career, which is the careful examination of difficult work, gathering evidence from a text. These are things that will repay again and again. I'm not sure if that's enough of an answer. I'm not sure whether there's any reason outside a text besides living within it that gives you enough reason to teach it, but that's a start. I don't know what you guys think.
I think one of the struggles in a piece like this, or one of the struggles that I certainly had as a teacher, there are so many things that you could focus on. I mean, if you watch your discussion of the text, it seems in some ways it's you as you watch it, you think, oh, of course that's the right line to focus on. Of course that's the right word to focus on. Of course that's the right historical reference to explore. But there are a lot in
exactly
here.
Right. You're
I was looking at paragraph. Let me see. 15 and 16, and you've got, and I was thinking about this, largely as a former history teacher, thinking about, you've got this reference to Brown versus Board of Education.
Yep.
You've got a reference to Thomas Aquinas. You've got a reference to Martin Buber, who I have to say I have no idea who Martin Buber is, right? And Paul Tillich, I also know who he is.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking, wow, if I was teaching this, we could have a whole conversation about why cite that author, why cite that philosopher, what's the power of that argument.
Yeah.
But you can't possibly
get through
all of those.
Yeah.
You'd never get through
Be deadly.
You'd never get through the text.
Exactly right.
So how did you, when you were sitting with the other authors of the Common Core looking at this text, how do you make those choices, or what's the rationale for those choices?
I think one first thing to say maybe is that it's exciting that we have them, meaning that the text is this rich is not just a flaw, but a very exciting aspect of it, that different people will follow different things and see different powerful things within it, that it's like rich with veins. And I think you're right, but I think the fact is that's nice, but it's totally overwhelming as a teacher if you try to follow every thread. And we've come up with 3 or 4 kind of working principles I'll share, but I want to admit it's just a hard question you've asked, and there's no right answer, as it were, to what to focus on. It's a constant approximation, figuring it out. But here are a few principles. One is, it's always helpful to get as much as you can from the text itself. So while you may not know anything about Martin Buber, a very interesting question is, what can you learn about him just from what is said here? So the text gives you enough to say a very important part of his thinking was the distinction between I, thou, and I, it. And that gives us that without knowing a word more about him. Or he tells you what Thomas Aquinas said. We may not know a thing more about Aquinas, but he does keep quoting them. Because one thing to keep in mind is remember, King wrote this letter to the American people. He was not expecting that the reader of it would know all these figures. But he's giving a synopsis even as he quotes them. And so I don't think it's incumbent on us as readers to follow up on every one. So the first question is, for kids as readers, how much can they draw from the text itself? You always want to ask yourself, how can they make do? The second thing I'll tell you, which may be unpopular to say, is I think we as readers often decide, what can we skip? In other words, I don't fully get this, but I get it enough to keep moving. I think it's okay to say that, because you can't read complicated things without choosing. There are some references that you don't quite get, but you're not going to follow up on.
Well, and that's something that good readers do on a very regular basis.
Exactly right.
Anyway, organically, without making conscious decisions. Like, I don't need to know that right now. I'm going to move on.
I don't need to know that right now. I can learn more about that later. Let me see how this unfolds. Often, you might say, maybe he'll say more about this in a while. Let's keep moving. But then occasionally, you're going to say, this is such a cornerstone.
Yeah.
He repeats it, he refers to it a lot, you think it's really fundamental to his thinking, and you might choose to then take a whole other step. For example, amidst all these fancy thinkers that he refers to, he refers particularly to Socrates twice in the letter, quite emphatically. Right. And you might say, you know what? After we're done, we've got a vague image of Socrates in this. Maybe since King has talked about him twice, it's time to take a look at that and read a portion of the Apology. So I think the kinds of things you ask yourself is, first, how much can kids get from the text itself? Does it give you any working knowledge that you can draw upon? Because that's the goal of reading, is to gain as much as you can. Second, weirdly, is this essential to pause and stop now, or can I get a rough understanding and keep moving? Rough understandings are very important. Kind of having the stamina to be okay that you don't understand everything. And then finally, third, where is something to begin to resonate and repeat where it's become fundamental? But these, like you said, Commissioner, are all judgments, and we'll make them differently, and we'll learn through our experience with students.
Can we go into the actual text a little
Yep.
bit deeper and start? I would love to know, John, for example, some of the, where did you go? So if we stop where David left off in what he was sharing earlier, which is paragraph 10, with the notion of tension, and then we sort of dig in like 11, 12, 13. You started talking about some of these paragraphs earlier. Where does your own mind as a scholar, as a thinker, take you when you dive into the text?
I think it's interesting that, my eyes go right to paragraph 13, and maybe it's because this time thing is, to me, a big piece of his argument is about time and urgency, and sort of pushing back against the argument of white moderates to wait and go slow, and so he sort of keeps coming back to that theme, and so I think that there's a lot of power in 13, where he says, frankly, I've yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. I think that's very powerful. And then that next paragraph, he sort of puts the reader in the situation of the oppressed person and sort of forces you to say, if you felt these things, could you wait? Would you wait? I think that's very powerful.
His use of the word
framing.
you in that paragraph is interesting to me, because up until now, the you has been you, moderate clergyman, in your life as you currently know it, and suddenly he's sort of relentlessly using you in a very different, pluck you out of that planet and put you into a new reality.
Yes.
Try this, try this, try this, try
Yes.
this. The other thing about 14, though, that's fascinating to me is that it seems like a place that is simpler to dive into as a teacher. I don't want to say easier, but it's seductive, I think, as a teacher to dive into this paragraph, because it is so. It describes such an awful reality, and it paints the nightmare of segregation so poetically and so relentlessly, by placing the white moderate into that reality. But it doesn't necessarily require a lot of sort of analytical skill to deconstruct what King is up to in this paragraph.
Yes.
If you know
yes,
what I
I think
mean.
that's right. That's right. And there's real risk that the student sort of says, well, what's a time when I felt bad or I felt mistreated? Right. There's not a lot that's sort of challenging for the reader in that.
Right. And the language is complex. But
yes.
And it was so interesting, though, how the commissioner described it at first, because what he did, rather than just lingering on those unforgettable descriptions, which are worth some time, he also talked about it in terms of the structure of King's argument, which is what I think we're trying to do here, which is follow the argument line by line. So he says in paragraph 13, he insists that that you need to have a different perspective, that those who are saying wait are different than those who are waiting. Yeah. And then what's interesting about paragraph 14 is it gets really long, vast, compared to the shorter paragraph before it, and he really tries you to put them in their shoes. That depth where students are not only seeing what an author is doing, but beginning to wonder why, what new technique is emerging here, how does it build the argument, how is it connected, that I think deepens it and makes these details then part of the work he's doing.
If you push forward into what happens next.
Yes, exactly right. No, I think, let me give you a kind of funny example, Kate, of exactly what you're talking about. I was talking to a group of teachers the other day about a very different text, about Phineas Gage, who's the guy who gets a crowbar put through his head and it affects the way he thinks, and it's very interesting to all the brain scientists of the day, because it changes his emotional reactions, but not the way he thinks, very surprisingly. And this set of ELA teachers was dying to talk about the narrative elements of the story. Where did he go in his life? How did he feel about it? But actually the most powerful part of the text for the kids learning was the part about how it affected brain science at the time.
Yeah.
What kind of information did it present to scientists? And because of the training and patterns we've had in ELA, I think sometimes we can go for the more narrative, the more descriptive, at the expense of the argument, the claim. And I think the core standards ask us to refocus and say, what's the argument here? How does it build statement by statement? Not just the narrative details and their beauty, but also the claims, the evidence, and what information, what exact facts here are stated and not stated. That kind of precision is a new part of the core.
Even for a history teacher who's trying to
Exactly
make this, the case about what Jim Crow was like, right? So
exactly right.
but to actually say one of the reasons King was impactful is because he made a strong argument.
Exactly right.
And didn't stop by just describing
Yes.
the nightmare.
Yeah.
What happens next? What happens in 15 through 20?
Well, that's where John began this very kind of philosophical. This is a demanding philosophical move, right? And it's amazing because it happens right after 14. What you said was the easier. I mean, isn't it amazing that he goes from this description that almost all of us can immediately grasp of this incredible picture of the signs and the most basic language, and then the next paragraph he mentions Augustine, you know, Tillich, and all these other people, and Martin Buber. All of a sudden, he moves from that direct voice to this very philosophical treatise on just and unjust law, and what does it mean? And I think for students that's very exciting because I think the question of whether to follow a law is pretty interesting to them. What rules can they break? What rules can't they break?
And whose rules are they?
Exactly.
Yes. But again, that's one of those challenges, right? Because kids are going to want to take that off into a conversation about rules and rule breaking.
Exactly right.
This is an unjust, this uniform is an unjust law.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, again, I think that the discipline that you're calling for is so important, to stick with the text, stick with King's argument, and try to avoid going too quickly to the easy connections.
And you know, one reason for that is if you look carefully at this, he actually is trying out several different defenses.
That's right.
He's almost as if he's nervous, but he says, so in paragraph 16 he says, what's the difference? Can you tell the difference between a just and unjust law? And then he says, well, let me give you another example and another reason. And then in 18 he says explicitly, let me give you another explanation. I'm going to try a different. So he erects. One problem when we jump so quickly to what rules is if we don't do the work of following King, we won't see the range of arguments he makes, et cetera, because he makes several different ones.
But to weave together the earlier conversation about the Gettysburg Address and why Lincoln goes to the Declaration of Independence, right? This is what the Declaration of Independence does. It lays out a chain of argument to justify revolution. And he's laying out a chain of argument to justify civil disobedience. And in many ways, there are parallels between these arguments. And if students have access to those, to all three of those texts, that's life-changing, right?
Yeah, totally. And what you just did was magnificent, because what you did is you said, if and only if I read each one carefully, the Declaration, and see how the most seeming rational, calm arguments are justifying a bloody revolution, which is what you gradually grasp the more you read that. You say, wow, these claims seem self-evident, but they lead to a lot of radical moves. You're saying I really love that, because that kind of comparison can only work if you've studied the Declaration in Gettysburg with enough care that you hear that echo.
Can you guys help me track the argument starting at 15? I know if we go all the way back to the beginning, it's obviously the biblical. So this is resting on that early sort of layering. But the names and the references from 15 through 16, and then when he, to your point, David, he starts to take a different turn and make sort of a separate argument. I want to try to track it for a second and see what he's up to in these.
Would you begin by reading 15 out loud, just so we can all work?
Certainly. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools, at first glance it may seem rather paradoxical for us to consciously break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all.
You know, I was thinking as you were reading, it's so helpful, by the way, just you, even when you read it out loud, for me, I paid new attention to it. And my instructional objective for this paragraph would be for students to grasp, conversely, one has a moral responsibility. If they can get what does the word conversely mean there, and what's the structure of the argument to that moment, if they can understand that sentence, they'll have understood this whole paragraph, and they'll understood a lot how arguments can be constructed, because he does a very peculiar thing, right? He does a very daring thing. He says, aren't I being a hypocrite? He says, on the one hand, I'm saying, obey these laws and not others. So how can I do that? And the only way he saves himself is saying, well, there are two types. You asked earlier, where do you spend a lot of time? And I think it's on those words that shift the argument. A lot of academic vocabulary lies there, the use of consequently or conversely. And if kids understand those maneuvers, which they don't understand without support and guidance, they begin to see how the argument in one sentence builds on one another. And so let's look at another example of that, because paragraph 16 begins with a seemingly very simple word, which is now. What is the difference between the two? So that now is, you need to hear that as, okay, now I'm moving to the next step of my argument. How do I defend? Because if you're going to say there's a difference, how do I defend this difference? And so he says, now you might ask, he implies, what is the difference? But he doesn't say, you might ask. He kind of just says, now, what is the difference? And by now, he means, well, now we have a problem we have to solve, which is if you're going to say you should support some laws and not others. And I think that as we're walking through this together, it's great for students to hear that movement, because you know, Kate and I were discussing earlier, a great text to teach is something where something happens on every page, or maybe even something happens in most paragraphs. But I don't think it's self-evident what's happening.
Right. That's right.
One of the things that happens for me in this paragraph, if I look at sort of the center of the paragraph, the sentence that starts with segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. This is fascinating to me because the very next sentence, he says, hence segregation is not only politically, economically, blah, 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 because it's morally wrong and unsound. He doesn't pause to talk about the fact that he has just named sort of the central problem of slavery, of Jim Crow, of everything else that's happening. He has named dehumanizing, he has named objectification, and he doesn't spend any time on it. He talks about how those are the sort of central, this is the central crime of all of this, sort of these social constructs, but he doesn't stop there. He just names it and moves on and moves into sort of another level of this philosophical argument that he's making. And I noticed that when I reread it recently, and
I think you're right. It is a series of very dense sentences. You know, he is arguing with a lot of density here, because he goes from this kind of I, it, I, thou, and then he's got this, I find difficult, the Paul Tillich one. I mean, the I, it versus I, thou, a thing versus I get that a bit, but then the hard one is Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness?
Yeah, what is
that
going
to
on
me
in this
is
sentence?
like one of those like, whoa. And I'll admit, again, and people may howl when I say this, occasionally when dealing with a difficult text, there is such a difficult sentence, there's such a difficult move, that taking all the time it would take to work through that with all students, you might just say, whoa, that just got very complicated. Maybe we'll keep going and come back to that one.
Well, the three of us could talk about that sentence for an hour.
That's my sense. I think here he becomes so dense and is playing on notions of sin and justice in ways that I find him harder to follow here without maybe some more background. What do you guys think? I think that sentence is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation? Who's man here? Who's his awful estrangement?
Well, would there be enough payoff in the classroom?
That's what I want
to really dive in.
It sort of depends on your line of analysis, because if you know, to go back to the point you made about kind of who's he writing to?
Yes.
Right, and so you know, to his audience, to the white moderate clergyman. right? He's speaking their language.
That's
right?
exactly
He's
right.
speaking
That's
in
exactly
sort of
right. That's really nicely
clergy
done.
talk.
That's exactly right.
And
He
so,
turns it to sin.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
right.
And I think that's probably powerful for his audience, but maybe
Yeah.
I think you're right, a potential distraction for students because it's sort of a deep theological
Yes,
point.
that's right.
Yeah.
No, but John, maybe you just undid our point though, because part of what you're saying is, if what we're trying to do here is teach students about making a strong argument against an existing argument that's coming at them with evidence that will matter to the reader, to the arguee,
Right.
then
right.
part of what he's building, part of why he's including that.
But I think that it would be okay to say, you see how he's moved from making a general argument about
Yeah.
morals in general to moving to this talk about sin. And even if we don't get exactly what he means by man's estrangement or this tragic separation, we can get this move towards a discussion of sin and putting it in very different terms and
Yes.
understand a lot.
Yes.
And then we could also spend time to think about, I just think it's worth admitting that existential expression of man's
absolutely.
tragic separation is going to be something that's going to take a lot of work
Yes.
for, and may refer
me.
to ideas
For you.
outside of
Yes.
this text to
Oh,
really
yes.
fully understand.
Definitely.
He then, by the way, interestingly, may catch himself. If you look at the beginning of 17, he says in a funny, given what we've just been talking about, he kind of says, like, let me get back to the rough ground here, people. Let us
Right.
consider a more concrete example
Yeah.
of just and unjust laws. And that's why I think sometimes staying with an author is as important as just stopping at any one point, because he kind of realizes, let me get a little more concrete.
Right.
And he then defines it. He says an unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself.
Yeah.
These are dense sentences, right? Like what is that rule again?
So in the planning of teaching this text, it would be an interesting thing to try to figure out together at what point. David mentioned earlier, not pausing the movie and saying, "What do you think of the characters so far?" Like it would be an interesting question to ask. At what point do you let the student? Are you asking students to kind of flow through the text, and at what point are you sort of pausing, collecting, creating opportunities for deep thought about what is going on in the text?
Right. And it may depend. I mean, it may depend on the skills that students are bringing into the room. It may depend on the history versus the ELA classroom. It may depend whether it's 9th graders or 11th graders, and how much kind of world and life they are bringing into the classroom with them. I mean, I think that's, and to your earlier point, David, about, and really started with Kate's point about how you need to talk and plan as you're looking at a text and thinking about teaching it, right? Those are these are big questions that sometimes it's helpful to have a colleague to just talk it through.
And it can matter a lot where kids go. In other words, they may draw you somewhere because they're
that's
fascinated.
right.
One other thing I just think we all have to admit, and what's great about what just happened, is I'm not sure what King means by that sentence, even though I've read this so many times. And I think if, as teachers, we're going to walk in with difficult texts, we have to admit there will be moments where a teacher admits, I'm not quite sure. That is the teacher.
That's
the teacher. It's so safe. It has to be safe to say. And then maybe a bright student, or maybe a student who's looking at a different route, will say, "Hey, wait, you missed this, or you saw this." And I think that playfulness that we can all prepare, but sometimes the text surprises you or confuses you. And I think it's great as a teacher.
Observations surprise you.
Exactly. You know the text you're going to teach, and you have prepared, but then there's part of it that's open.
Yeah. So are conversations like this important?
Yeah. I mean, they're fun. So that's good. I mean, and I mean, not to be trite about it, but sort of as a teacher, as an educator, you want to kind of share. There's power and meaning in sharing the work, right, and talking through how you will approach teaching.
Right.
But I also think forcing yourself to get deep into the text is really important, and that is easier to do in a sense in conversation than it is on your own, I think.
Yeah, no, I really imagine a world where if we said throughout New York State, we hope that once this year, at least once, teachers are going to teach such a text, we might say equally, in an equally strong voice, and have a really great conversation with a colleague.
Right.
Maybe before and after, and kind of in an ongoing way, that the adult conversations may be as important as the conversations with students.
Yes.
I wonder, Kate, if that's part of what you're implying, that the way we're talking to one another is an essential part of this work, and not just the work in the classroom.
Yeah, I assert that it is impossible to do this well with students if adults haven't done this with each other about whatever their content is, right? So, I mean, even to step outside of literacy for a moment, to even think about significant math concepts or science concepts or, or social studies concepts, if teachers are not spending deep, high-quality time talking about, not hours of time, but with this conversation, I don't know, took 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I'm far more prepared to teach this text now than I was 20 minutes ago, no matter how many times I read it or discuss it. Every time you dive into the content, into the text, if we're talking about literacy, you get more facile with it. You get more familiar, more intimate with it. And that fluency creates a better teacher.
And I'll add one condition of it, just that is implied but maybe not said, which is it's probably rare, Commissioner, that you get this kind of time to spend on 4 paragraphs.
That's right.
I bet you're a pretty busy guy. And I think that teachers are pretty busy too.
Yeah.
And I think if we have that teacher-to-teacher conversation that is at too high a level, it gets nowhere.
Yeah.
Like if you talk generally about how do you teach kids something difficult.
Yes.
What we dared to do is to pick one particular thing, this particular letter, these particular paragraphs within the letter, and really linger over them. And I think that's the kind of shift is, do we create room within schools to pick something so specific?
To go back to my hobby horse of time,
Yeah.
so folks just need to start,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. That you know, I think one thing people say was, well, we should organize schools differently,
Yeah.
so that there's a lot more time for adult conversation. And I take that point. We should, but there's a million reasons why it's really complicated to do that.
Yeah.
So, you know, pick a period a week and make
Don't
a book
wait.
club and start.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, you know, if there's one takeaway from kind of where we are on the Common Core, it's that it does require big shifts, and it's not inevitable.
Yeah.
So we have to start, and we should start with sitting with a text that's really rich and getting into a conversation about it.
Yeah. Adult to adult conversation
That's right.
about the work.
That's right.
And that maybe the ways of talking to students are not so unlike the best ways of talking to one another.
What do you mean, David?
I mean that one thing that can really happen as you get engaged with students around this stuff is that if you as a teacher are really curious about more deeply understanding the text that you're teaching and excited about that, when students make comments and see things, you often see something you didn't see before, just like when and I think that it would be nice if classrooms began to resemble the kind of conversations we hope to have with each other.
That's right.
Where we explore something together, even though you're of course more intentional and you're setting up the questions and guiding it in a different way. It also, hopefully, is itself a chance to re-encounter something you care about.
Yeah.